Karoline Leavitt sat composed in the buzzing courtroom, her steady gaze cutting through the tension like a blade. Across from her, Officer Daniel Graves fidgeted in the witness stand, his uniform no shield against the unraveling truth. What happened next, captured on a grainy dashcam, would leave the jury speechless and turn a routine traffic stop into a national reckoning. Before we dive into the full story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. If you love gripping tales like this, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we've got another incredible story waiting for you. The streets of Washington, D.C. stretched out in a quiet hum, the kind of stillness that felt heavy after a long day. Karoline Leavitt gripped the steering wheel of her sleek black sedan, her mind still racing from a marathon of meetings at the White House. As the press secretary, her days were a whirlwind of briefing rooms, flashing cameras, and carefully crafted statements. Tonight, though, all she wanted was the comfort of her Georgetown apartment, a glass of red wine, maybe some jazz to unwind. The dashboard clock blinked 10:47 p.m., and the city lights blurred past her like streaks of paint on a dark canvas. She exhaled, letting the tension of the day seep out of her shoulders. Then, a flicker in her rearview mirror jolted her back to attention. Red and blue lights pulsed in the darkness, sharp and insistent. A police cruiser loomed behind her, its sirens silent but its presence loud enough to tighten her chest. Karoline frowned, her brow creasing as she eased the car to the curb. She wasn't speeding. Her speedometer had hovered at a steady 30 miles per hour. Her taillights were fine, she'd checked them just last week. No traffic violations came to mind. Yet here she was, the night interrupted by an unexpected shadow. She shifted the car into park and waited, hands resting lightly on the wheel where they could be seen. Years in the public eye had taught her caution, precision, every move calculated, every word measured. The driver's side window hummed as it slid down, letting the crisp October air spill into the car. Footsteps crunched against the asphalt, deliberate and slow, until a figure emerged in the glow of a street lamp. Officer Daniel Graves stood there, his face half-lit, half-shadowed, his badge glinting under the faint light. His eyes were unreadable, but there was a hardness in his jaw that set her on edge. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice flat, clipped. He leaned slightly, a flashlight flicking on to sweep across the interior of her car. The beam danced over the leather seats, the neatly folded coat in the back, the stack of briefing notes she'd meant to review later. Karoline kept her expression neutral, though her pulse quickened. "Officer," she replied, her tone polite but firm. "Is there a problem?" Graves didn't answer right away. His flashlight lingered on her face as if searching for something, a crack, a flinch. She didn't give him one. Instead, she met his gaze, her hazel eyes steady, unflinching. He straightened, the beam snapping off with a click. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, the words less a request than a command. Karoline blinked, her mind racing to process the abrupt shift. "Is there a reason for that?" she asked, keeping her voice even, her hands still visible. His expression tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," he repeated, his tone sharpening. She studied him for a beat longer, noting the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his radio. Something was off, too off for a routine stop, but she knew better than to escalate this herself. With a slow, deliberate breath, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door, stepping onto the pavement. The night air bit at her skin, and she stood tall, her tailored coat swaying slightly in the breeze. Graves circled her car, peering through the windows with an intensity that felt performative. Karoline watched him, her heart thudding steadily but firmly. She'd faced hostile press, combated lawmakers, crises that could topple administrations. This was just another test, wasn't it? Yet the silence stretched, heavy and charged, as he returned to face her. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked finally, his voice low, almost accusatory. "No, officer," she replied, her words crisp, unwavering. "I'd like to understand." He tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You'll see," he said, and in that moment, Karoline knew this wasn't about traffic. This was something else, something personal, something dangerous. The night had just begun to unravel. Karoline Leavitt stood on the cold pavement, the faint hum of Washington, D.C.'s nightlife buzzing in the distance. Officer Daniel Graves loomed before her, his smirk twisting into something sharper, more deliberate. The air between them crackled with unspoken intent, and Karoline's instincts, honed by years of navigating political minefields, screamed that this wasn't a random encounter. She kept her posture straight, her hands loose at her sides, refusing to let him see the unease flickering beneath her calm exterior. "You were causing a disturbance back at the intersection," Graves said, his voice low but laced with accusation. He stepped closer, his boots scuffing the asphalt, his flashlight now dangling idly at his hip. "Obstructing traffic, raising a fuss, you know how it goes." Karoline's brows knit together, a crease forming as she replayed the last half hour in her mind. She'd made a smooth left turn at 17th Street, signaled properly, waited for the light. No horns, no chaos. "That's not accurate, officer," she said evenly, her tone measured but firm. "I followed traffic laws. If there's a specific incident I'd like you to clarify." Graves' eyes narrowed, a glint of something dark flashing in them. "You questioning me?" he snapped, his hand shifting to rest on his belt, inches from his holster. The move was subtle, but Karoline caught it. A power play, a warning. She didn't flinch. "I'm asking for clarity," she replied, her voice steady as steel. "That's all." He let out a short, humorless laugh, turning his head to spit onto the curb. "Clarity," he muttered, as if the word amused him. Then, without warning, he reached for his cuffs, the metal glinting under the street lamp. "Turn around," he ordered. "You're under arrest." The words hit her like a jolt, but Karoline didn't move. "On what grounds?" she asked, her pulse quickening but her composure intact. Graves stepped forward, closing the gap. "Obstructing a public roadway and resisting an officer," he said, his tone clipped. "Now, turn around, or I'll make this harder than it needs to be." For a split second, doubt flickered. Should she push back, call his bluff? But the deserted street, the late hour, and the cold authority in his stance told her compliance was the smarter play. She turned slowly, hands rising to meet his grip as the cuffs clicked shut around her wrists. The metal bit into her skin, and a flush of indignation rose in her chest. This wasn't just wrong, it was personal. The ride to the precinct was a blur of silence, punctuated only by the static crackle of Graves' radio. Karoline sat in the back seat, her mind racing. She'd been in tough spots before, grilled by reporters, cornered by senators, but this felt different, orchestrated. At the station, the booking process unfolded with humiliating efficiency. Fingerprints, a mugshot, her name logged into a system she'd spent her career trying to reform. She was given one call, and she dialed her lawyer, Michael Torres, her voice low but resolute. "I need you at the precinct, now." As she sat in the holding cell, the pieces began to click. She remembered Graves, vaguely, but distinctly. Months ago at a Capitol Hill event on police reform, she'd spoken out about accountability, her words sharp and uncompromising. Graves had been there, off-duty, lingering near the back. She'd caught him staring, his face a mask of quiet resentment, after she'd fielded a question that left a group of officers, including him, red-faced and defensive. Had that been the spark, a grudge nursed into this? The cell door clanged open and Torres strode in, his suit rumpled but his eyes sharp. "They're saying you yelled at him, disrupted traffic," he said, flipping through a hastily printed report. "It's nonsense, but they've got you on resisting, too." Karoline leaned forward, her voice steady despite the ache in her wrists. "It's a setup, Michael. He's lying, and I think someone put him up to it." Torres frowned, scribbling notes. "Who'd want you smeared like this?" Karoline's mind flashed to the enemies she'd made. Rival politicians, lobbyists, anyone threatened by her push for reform. "Too many to count," she said grimly. "But we're not letting this slide." As Torres left to file motions, Karoline sat back, the weight of the night settling in. Graves had picked the wrong fight. She wasn't just a press secretary, she was a survivor. And whatever game this was, she'd play it to win. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. hummed with a restless energy as Karoline Leavitt stepped through its towering doors. Weeks had passed since that frigid night on the roadside, but the sting of the handcuffs lingered in her memory, a quiet fuel for the fire in her chest. Today she faced Officer Daniel Graves in court, her tailored navy suit a stark contrast to the sterile white walls of the chamber. Cameras flashed outside, reporters jostling for a soundbite, but inside the air was thick with anticipation. This wasn't just a case. It was a reckoning. Karoline took her seat beside Michael Torres, her lawyer's sharp eyes scanning the room. Across the aisle, Graves slouched in his chair, his uniform crisp but his posture uneasy. He avoided her gaze, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against the table. The prosecution, representing Karoline in this rare twist of a private citizen suing an officer, had built a tight case: false arrest, fabricated charges, abuse of power. The judge, a stern woman with silver-streaked hair, banged her gavel, and the room fell silent. The lead prosecutor, a wiry man named Paul Hensley, rose with a calm authority. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice cutting through the stillness. "We're here to prove that Officer Daniel Graves knowingly falsified his account of an incident involving Miss Karoline Leavitt, press secretary to the President of the United States. On October 23rd, he arrested her without cause, claiming she disrupted traffic and resisted arrest. The evidence will show otherwise." Hensley signaled to an aide and a large screen flickered to life. The grainy footage wasn't from Graves' dashcam, his had conveniently malfunctioned, but from a traffic camera at 17th Street. The jury leaned forward as the video played, Karoline's sedan easing to a stop, her hands visible on the wheel, her voice calm and polite as Graves approached. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" The exchange unfolded exactly as she remembered. Measured, compliant, no hint of aggression. When Graves ordered her out, she stepped onto the pavement without protest, her movements slow and deliberate. The footage ended with her in cuffs, her expression one of quiet disbelief. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Jurors exchanged glances, some scribbling notes. Graves shifted, his jaw tightening as Hensley turned to him. "Officer Graves," he said, pacing slowly, "your report states Ms. Leavitt shouted obscenities, lunged at you, and disrupted traffic. Care to explain why this video shows none of that?" Graves cleared his throat, his voice gruff but unsteady. "The camera didn't catch everything," he said. "She got hostile after it cut off. Reports don't lie." Hensley raised an eyebrow, letting the silence stretch. "Reports don't lie," he echoed. "But officers do?" Before Graves could respond, the defense attorney, a stocky man with a nasal voice, stood. "Objection, Your Honor, speculative." The judge waved it off. "Overruled. Answer the question, officer." Graves faltered, his eyes darting to his lawyer. "I stand by my report," he muttered, but the words lacked conviction. Karoline watched, her heart steady but her mind racing. The video was damning, but she knew this wouldn't be simple. Then came the twist. The defense called a witness, a lanky man in an ill-fitting suit, his hair slicked back with too much gel. "State your name," the attorney barked. "Thomas Rourke," he replied, smirking faintly as he took the stand. "I saw it all," Rourke said, leaning into the microphone. "That night near 17th Street, she was yelling at the officer, waving her arms like some lunatic, traffic backed up because of her." The room erupted in whispers. Karoline's stomach dropped. She'd never seen this man before, but something about his smug demeanor tugged at her memory. Hensley objected. "No record of this witness at the scene." But the judge allowed it. Her lips pursed. Torres leaned close, his voice a whisper. "He's lying. We'll dig into him." Karoline nodded, her eyes narrowing as Rourke stepped down. Then it hit her. Thomas Rourke. She'd fired him 2 years ago, back when he'd been an aide to Senator Hargrove, a bitter rival who'd clashed with her over police reform. Hargrove had the motive, the means. This wasn't just Graves. It was a setup, a political hit. The murmurs grew louder as reporters scribbled furiously. Public doubt seeped in, she could feel it. Outside, headlines were already spinning. Press secretary's temper tantrum. Karoline gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles whitening. The truth was on that tape, but Rourke's lie had muddied it. She met Graves' gaze for the first time that day. He smirked, fleetingly, thinking he'd won. She didn't blink. This wasn't over. The courtroom air felt electric, thick with the weight of Thomas Rourke's testimony. Karoline Leavitt sat rigid, her fingers curled tightly around a pen, its tip hovering over a blank notepad. The murmurs from the gallery swelled like a rising tide, and she could almost hear the headlines sharpening their claws outside. Across the room, Officer Daniel Graves sat straighter now, his earlier unease replaced by a flicker of confidence. He thought he'd dodged the bullet. Rourke's lie had given him an edge. But Karoline knew better. This wasn't just about one rogue cop anymore. It was a chessboard, And she wasn't the only player moving pieces. Michael Torres scribbled furiously beside her, his pen scratching against paper as he muttered under his breath. "Hargrove's behind this, I'd bet my license on it." Karoline nodded, her mind already tracing the threads. Senator Hargrove, a bulldog of a man with a vendetta against her police reform agenda. Rourke had been his lapdog once, and now he was here, spinning tales to bury her. But why Graves? What tied a beat cop to a Capitol Hill power broker? The prosecution regrouped fast. Paul Hensley stood, adjusting his tie with a calmness that belied the storm brewing. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "we'd like to introduce new evidence that casts serious doubt on Officer Graves' credibility. And this entire defense." The judge raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Proceed." Hensley held up a small USB drive, its black casing glinting under the courtroom lights. "This is an audio recording, obtained legally from a confidential source within the Metropolitan Police Department." The defense attorney shot up. "Objection! Chain of custody! Where did this come from?" Hensley didn't flinch. "The source is protected, Your Honor, but the recording has been authenticated by forensic experts. It's admissible." The judge leaned forward, peering over her glasses. "I'll allow it. Let's hear it." A technician plugged the drive into a laptop, and the room held its breath as static crackled through the speakers. Then Graves' voice emerged, rough and unmistakable. "Yeah, she's a problem," he said, the words dripping with disdain. "Hargrove's guy said she's pushing that reform bill too hard. Said if I could pin something on her, make it stick, I'd get a nice bonus. Told me to rough her up a bit, make it look good." A second voice, muffled but smug, replied, "Just don't screw it up, Danny. She's got eyes on her." The audio cut off, and the courtroom erupted. Jurors gasped, reporters scrambled, and the gallery buzzed like a hive. Graves' face drained of color, his hands gripping the table as if it might anchor him. The defense attorney sputtered, This is hearsay," but the judge silenced him with a sharp gavel strike. "Order," she barked, her voice slicing through the chaos. "Officer Graves, do you deny?" "That's your voice." Graves opened his mouth, then closed it, his eyes darting wildly. I don't," he stammered, but the words crumbled under the weight of the room's stairs. Hensley pressed forward, relentless. "So, officer, you were paid to frame Miss Leavitt by Senator Hargrove's operative. Is that correct?" Graves' silence was louder than any confession. Karoline's pulse raced, but she kept her face still. A mask of composure. Hargrove's name wasn't a surprise, she'd suspected him. But hearing it confirmed, hearing the casual malice in Graves' voice lit a fire in her. This wasn't just about her arrest anymore. It was about a system rotten enough to let men like Hargrove pull strings, and men like Graves dance on them. The judge turned to Hensley. "Do you have more?" Hensley nodded. "We're requesting a full investigation into Senator Hargrove's involvement, Your Honor. This goes beyond one officer." Before she could rule, Graves lurched to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is all a damned game," he shouted, his voice raw, unhinged. "You think you're untouchable, Leavitt. You and your reform crap. It's all just power plays." The bailiff moved to restrain him, but Graves shoved past, bolting for the exit. The room exploded into chaos. Shouts, gasps, the thud of footsteps as security chased him down the hall. Karoline watched, her breath steady, her mind clear. Graves was a symptom, Hargrove a disease. She'd won this round, but the real fight was just beginning. The courtroom doors swung shut behind the last of the fleeing reporters, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. Karoline Leavitt remained seated at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly, her gaze fixed on the now empty witness stand where Daniel Graves had unraveled moments before. The echo of his outburst, "It's all just power plays," still hung in the air, a jagged truth she couldn't shake. He'd won, hadn't she? The audio had exposed Graves, implicated Hargrove, and sent the officer running like a cornered animal. The judge had adjourned the session, promising a ruling soon, and Michael Torres had clapped her shoulder with a weary grin. "We've got them," he'd said. But the victory felt hollow, a thin veneer over something darker. She gathered her papers and stepped into the hall, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the marble floor. Outside, the D.C. night was crisp, the sky a deep indigo streaked with clouds. Karoline pulled her coat tighter, her breath fogging in the chill as she hailed a car back to Georgetown. The driver's radio buzzed with breaking news. Officer Graves flees courtroom after explosive testimony. She tuned it out, her mind replaying the day, the tape, Rourke's smirk, Graves' desperation. Hargrove's shadow loomed largest, but she'd faced worse. She'd push for that investigation, dismantle his network. Justice wasn't done, but it was close. Her phone vibrated as the car pulled onto her street. A blocked number. She hesitated, then answered. A voice, low and distorted, slithered through the line. "You think it's over, Leavitt? Look out your window." Her stomach tightened. She ended the call without a word, peering through the tinted glass as the car slowed. At first, she saw nothing but the quiet row of brownstones, their windows glowing softly. Then, shapes emerged. Dozens of figures spilling onto the sidewalk, their silhouettes stark against the streetlights. Placards bobbed in the air, scrawled with Sharpie, "Leavitt lies, resign now, abuser of power." A chant rose, ragged but growing, "Justice for Graves." Karoline's breath caught. The driver glanced back, uneasy. "You okay, ma'am?" She nodded mutely, stepping out as the car pulled away. The crowd surged closer, faces twisted with anger, some young, some older, a mix of strangers united by fury. A woman in a red scarf shoved a phone in her face, recording. "You framed him!" she shrieked. "You're the corrupt one!" Karoline stood frozen, the accusations battering her like waves. Framed him? The irony stung. She'd spent weeks proving Graves' lies, yet here they were, a mob swallowing a narrative she hadn't seen coming. Her phone buzzed again. Taurus. "Karoline, turn on the news," he said, his voice tight. She ducked into her building, locking the door as the chants faded to a dull roar. In her apartment, the TV flickered to life. A pundit's voice filled the room. Leaked reports suggest Leavitt orchestrated the arrest to push her reform agenda. Insiders claim she provoked Graves, staged the whole thing. A grainy photo flashed, her in cuffs that night, her expression stern, captioned, "Calculated move, lies, spun from thin air, but they'd taken root fast." Hargrove's doing, no doubt, turning her win into a weapon. She sank onto the couch, the weight of it crashing down. The courtroom victory had been real, the evidence, the audio, Graves' flight, but the court of public opinion was another beast. Someone had flooded social media, twisted the story. She wasn't the victim, but the villain. Her phone lit up with notifications, colleagues distancing themselves, allies silent. The mob outside grew louder, their shadows flickering through her curtains. She'd fought for truth, for reform, but Hargrove had outplayed her. Not with law, but with perception. Karoline stood, pacing to the window. The crowd stretched down the block now, a sea of rage she couldn't reason with. Justice had prevailed in court, but out here, it was drowning. She grabbed her phone, dialing a number she rarely used. A contact from her early days, a fixer named Alina, sharp and discreet. The line clicked. "Alina," she said, her voice low, resolute. "It's me. We need a new plan." She hung up, staring into the night. Hargrove thought he'd won, but Karoline Leavitt didn't fold. The game had shifted and she'd play it. Smarter, harder, unseen. The chance faded as she turned away, already plotting her next move. Karoline Leavitt's journey in this story reveals profound truths about justice, resilience, and the human spirit. Her battle against Officer Graves and the shadowy forces behind him teaches us that truth, while powerful, isn't always enough on its own. In life, we may face moments where facts are twisted and victories are overshadowed by perception, much like Karoline's courtroom win dissolving into public scorn. This reminds us to stand firm in our integrity even when the crowd turns against us, trusting that our character shines through the noise. Her story also underscores the importance of empathy. Karoline fought not just for herself, but for those silenced by power, reflecting a humane call to uplift the voiceless. We can apply this by listening to others' struggles, offering support where systems fail. Yet, her unexpected setback, Hargrove's manipulation, shows that resilience isn't about avoiding falls, but rising with purpose. In our lives, when setbacks strike, we must adapt, seek allies, and forge new paths, as Karoline did with her final call to Elena. Ultimately, her tale urges us to blend courage with compassion, pursuing justice while embracing the messiness of human connection, because true strength lies in both.